The warning came in the dead of night. Captain Jake McGraw stared at the holographic display projected in the command center of Outpost Liberty, his jaw tightening. Across the vast reaches of the galaxy, the Galactic Council had officially delivered its message, transmitted through a secure channel. The Zelkar Dominion had spoken. Humans, the voice of the Council spokesperson had reverberated, cold and condescending. We extend an ultimatum. Surrender your sovereignty and submit to the governance of the Zelkar Dominion, or face obliteration. Your primitive technologies and unstable colonies cannot withstand our forces. This is your final chance. McGraw knew the galaxy had long viewed humanity with disdain, primitive, unruly, a species too wild for the galactic order. The Council had made that abundantly clear over the years. But this was different. His eyes scanned the hologram, which flickered momentarily as a static burst broke through the transmission. The faceless Council representative, a disembodied figure in ornate robes, repeated the words with a chilling finality. This is no negotiation. You are a relic, and we are your future. Not today, McGraw muttered to himself. The officer turned away from the display, his mind whirring with the enormity of the decision ahead. The Marines on Outpost Liberty had been on edge for weeks, ever since the arrival of the Zelkar scouts, but this ultimatum was the final sign of a coming storm. McGraw hadn't built a reputation on waiting for orders. He was a man of action. Captain, a voice called from the back of the room. Sergeant Mason Carter, his demolitions expert, walked forward, face hard and expression unreadable. His broad shoulders and battle-hardened demeanor told McGraw that Carter was already thinking what he was thinking. "We can't just roll over," Carter said, his voice low and steady, but heavy with certainty. McGraw nodded, already turning towards the map of the colony. "No, we can't. We've got maybe 72 hours before they arrive with full force. I'm not willing to let them walk all over us. And I'm damn sure not going to tell my men to lie down and die." Corporal David Rollins, known to the team as Preach, stepped up next to Carter. His calm demeanor belied the weight he carried, but anyone who had worked with him long enough knew his lethal precision in battle was only matched by his stoic faith. His deep voice broke the silence. "Captain, we fight. We fight for the men who came before us, and the ones who will come after. The Zelkar don't know what they're up against. We don't even know what we're up against yet," McGraw replied, though the uncertainty in his voice was fleeting. He always doubted, but never for long. Lieutenant Eric Dawson, the young officer who had been placed in charge of Outpost Liberty's defenses, cleared his throat. His blond hair, messy from stress, betrayed a nervous energy that had become too familiar. "Captain, with all due respect, they're claiming to have the power to wipe us out without breaking a sweat. They're shields." "Shields don't stop bullets," McGraw cut him off. His eyes narrowed, and he looked out the window at the barren landscape beyond the outpost's protective walls. "The Zelkar are too cocky. They think we're nothing but primitive little soldiers with no future. But we've got something they'll never understand. We're adaptable." Preach smiled, a thin, confident grin that revealed the true nature of the man behind the mask. "The question is, Captain, what are we going to use against them? What do we have that can hit hard enough to make them rethink that ultimatum?" McGraw glanced over at the walls of the outpost, reinforced but not invincible. They had taken some hits from the scouts, but that was nothing compared to what was coming. "We're going to make them regret thinking we're a joke. I'm talking about going old school." The silence in the room was palpable. Dawson, the rookie, frowned, trying to follow McGraw's train of thought. Carter, on the other hand, looked intrigued. "You're talking about the old Earth weapons?" Carter asked, his voice lowering, realizing what McGraw meant. McGraw nodded. "Yeah. Old iron, big boom, no finesse. The kind that makes people reconsider their superiority." Preach raised an eyebrow. "You mean artillery? The old school stuff? We don't exactly have a lot of that lying around." McGraw turned to Dawson, the young officer's skepticism still written across his face. "Get a team together. I want to go down to the old bunkers. We've got some relics stashed there, stuff most people forgot about. Might be enough to surprise these Zelkar." Dawson opened his mouth, but closed it quickly. There were no more objections. McGraw's authority was absolute in the field, and Dawson knew it. Yes, sir. The men filed out of the room, the weight of the situation settling around them. The gravity of the decision hung over the room like a thick fog. McGraw stood still for a moment, gazing at the map, the familiar call of duty already firing his resolve. Outpost Liberty wasn't just a remote colony. It was the first line of defense for the last human bastion in a galaxy that wanted nothing to do with them. And McGraw wouldn't let it fall without a fight. Not to the Zelkar, not to anyone. The next few days would be a race against time, against overwhelming odds. The Marines would have to rely on ingenuity, on a weapon that had been left behind in a world of plasma cannons and energy shields. But humanity's greatest strength had never been in its ability to adapt to the future. It was in its defiance of the present. And if the Zelkar thought they could simply walk all over humanity, well, they were about to learn a lesson they'd never forget. The battle was coming, and Captain McGraw was ready. He turned and strode out of the room, his footsteps heavy with purpose. The next morning, the Marines were already assembling by the outpost's underground bunker. The sky was a pale gray, clouds creeping across the horizon like silent predators. McGraw's boots echoed as he strode down the cold, metallic hall, the hum of the ventilation system the only sound besides the occasional murmur of his men. Sergeant Mason Carter stood at the front, his arms crossed, leaning against the edge of a rusted piece of machinery that once belonged to a long-forgotten artillery platform. His presence was as solid as the metal that surrounded them, a wall of experience that McGraw had come to trust implicitly. Carter wasn't just a demolitions expert. He was a man who could turn any scrap of equipment into a deadly weapon. Corporal David Preach, Rollins, was nearby, his eyes focused as he checked over the few old rifles they'd found, making sure everything was in working order. Despite his outward calm, there was a quiet intensity to him, a man who found peace in his faith and peace in the violent precision of his shots. Lieutenant Eric Dawson was pacing at the back, nervously tapping his fingers against the side of his helmet. His youth was undeniable in moments like this, a rawness to his demeanor that was always on the edge of breaking. McGraw knew Dawson was still figuring himself out, still trying to find his place among these seasoned warriors. The pressure of commanding a garrison under siege was enough to test any officer, let alone a young man thrown into the fray with no time for real experience. But Dawson had a good heart. McGraw could see that, and he was smart. The kid would come through. We have everything. McGraw's voice cut through the tension. Yeah, Captain, Carter replied. The M3A1s are locked and loaded, and we've got plenty of rounds. Old-school artillery with some new tricks up its sleeve. Let's just hope it does the trick. We'll make it work, McGraw said, his tone sharp. Let's move out. Time's wasting. As they made their way out of the bunker, McGraw couldn't shake the weight of the message they'd received. The Zelkar were not a people who played around. Their tech was vast, advanced in ways humanity could barely comprehend. They had weapons capable of razing entire colonies in a heartbeat, shields that could absorb anything short of a direct starship assault. And yet, they believed humans were inferior. The Marines reached a rugged landscape beyond the walls of the outpost, a desolate stretch of cracked earth and jagged rocks. The terrain would help conceal their movements, but it also worked against them. They couldn't afford to be seen. Their time to surprise the Zelkar was limited. Once we hit the bunker, we'll need to move fast, Carter said, his voice low. Can't risk lingering too long out here. McGraw nodded. Preach, Carter. You two set the charges. Dawson, you're with me. We'll bring up the rear. The group split off into their assigned tasks, moving with precision. McGraw had always trusted his men's instincts. They worked like a well-oiled machine, a team that had been through enough together to know each other's moves without a word. The old bunker wasn't far, a relic of a time before the Galactic Wars, abandoned and forgotten. But McGraw knew it was there, tucked away beneath the surface, and it held the key to their survival. A cache of weapons and tools from a different era, when humans relied more on firepower than on finesse. The M3A1 recoilless rifles were an afterthought now, obsolete in a galaxy dominated by energy-based warfare. But McGraw had learned long ago that the past had a way of catching up with the present. He was counting on that. When they reached the bunker, the dim light from their helmet lamps illuminated the old stone walls, cracked with age and neglect. McGraw led the way inside, his hand brushing against the cool, dusty surface of a forgotten piece of human history. The rest of the team followed silently, setting to work immediately. Carter worked quickly, setting up the charges with a practiced hand, his every move deliberate. Preach stood to the side, checking his equipment, his rifle a natural extension of his body. Dawson hesitated for a moment before kneeling next to McGraw, his face a mask of uncertainty. "Sir, you really think this is going to work?" Dawson asked, his voice barely audible in the stillness. McGraw didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let his gaze wander to the old artillery pieces scattered throughout the room. The M3A1 sat near the back, an ancient relic in a world of high-tech warfare. McGraw couldn't help but smile at the irony. The Zelkar might have energy shields that could block plasma bolts, but they hadn't accounted for the blunt force of old-fashioned, solid projectiles. "We're going to make it work, Lieutenant," McGraw said finally. "These weapons might be old, but they'll do the job. We're not facing a high-tech enemy right now. We're facing a race of arrogant fools who think they know everything about war." Dawson seemed to absorb the words, a quiet nod following. He had a lot to learn, but McGraw was confident that in time, the young officer would understand what it meant to lead men into the unknown. A sudden, violent explosion shook the ground beneath them, followed by a deep rumbling. McGraw snapped to attention, instinctively reaching for his weapon. "That's them," Carter said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "They're coming." The sound of alien war machines rumbling over the terrain grew louder by the second. The Zelkar had arrived. Preach checked his rifle one last time, his face set in grim determination. "Captain, we're ready. Let's show them what happens when you underestimate humanity." McGraw gripped the handle of the M3A1, its weight familiar, a comforting reminder of simpler days. The stakes had never been higher, but neither had the stakes ever been so personal. The fate of humanity, of their way of life, now rested on weapons long dismissed by those who thought themselves superior. "Let's give them a fight they'll never forget," McGraw muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Then, with one last look at his team, he signaled the start of their assault. The roar of ancient artillery filled the air as they launched their first barrage. They weren't just defending a colony anymore. They were defending humanity's right to stand tall in a galaxy that had underestimated them for far too long. The battle had begun. The ground shook as the first explosion sent a cloud of dust and debris into the air, obscuring the horizon for just a moment. The M3A1s fired again, their powerful recoil sending tremors through the air as solid slugs tore through the advancing Zelkar battle lines. The alien war machines, massive and towering, seemed impervious to anything the humans had thrown at them, their sleek, shimmering shields absorbing every shot with mocking ease. But the humans were relentless, their determination a fire that refused to die. "Keep it up, Marines," Captain McGraw shouted over the crackling comms, his voice harsh and commanding. "They'll break before we do. Trust me on that." Sergeant Mason Carter, his face smeared with dirt and sweat, nodded without a word. He worked tirelessly, adjusting the recoilless rifle, reloading with practiced precision. The explosions reverberated through his bones, but he kept his focus. He'd seen enough combat to know that victory wasn't about how strong your enemy was. It was about exploiting their arrogance, their assumption that they were untouchable. Preach moved with a quiet calm that contrasted with the chaos around him. His sniper rifle rested in his hands, his eyes scanning the battlefield for any sign of weakness in the Zelkar forces. The aliens might have had firepower, but they lacked the precision and resolve that came with being human. And Preach had a mind for finding weaknesses, no matter how well hidden. A flicker of movement caught his eye. A vulnerable point in the Zelkar armor. Without hesitation, he squeezed the trigger. The enemy officer crumpled to the ground, the carefully aimed shot shattering its skull. Preach exhaled, a single breath of satisfaction. The Zelkar hadn't seen it coming. "Good hit, Preach," McGraw called, his voice steady even as the battlefield around them erupted in chaos. The Zelkar responded with fury, their remaining forces launching a counteroffensive. Massive war mechs strode across the plains, their claws digging into the dirt as they advanced. They were formidable, too formidable, McGraw knew. If it came to a direct fight, they'd be overwhelmed. "Fall back. To the ridge," McGraw ordered, his mind working rapidly, calculating their next move. They had to make the Zelkar believe they were retreating, draw them into a trap. If they could just get the mechs into position, if they could catch them in the open. Carter gave a grunt of acknowledgement, already moving to load the next round into his weapon. "We're not done yet. Just get us into position, Captain." Dawson was silent as he followed, his eyes scanning the battlefield, trying to find the advantage. The kid was learning fast. McGraw had to give him that. His decisions were becoming more decisive, more instinctive. The pressure was molding him into something stronger, something that would make him a hell of a leader one day. But there was no time to focus on that now. They had to stay alive, first and foremost. As they moved toward the ridge, the rumble of approaching mechs grew louder. Their massive forms loomed on the horizon, seemingly unstoppable. But McGraw wasn't worried. He had one more trick up his sleeve. They reached the ridge, taking cover behind the jagged rocks and wreckage of a downed Zelkar scout ship. The Marines set up their weapons, positioning the recoilless rifles just beyond the rise so that the enemy wouldn't see them until it was too late. "Preach," McGraw said quietly. "Find the commander. Take him out. Then we'll hit the mechs from the side." "Got it, Captain," Preach responded, his voice a whisper as he set his sights on the battlefield. One shot, one kill. Carter checked his gear again, his eyes flicking to the approaching mechs. "We've got one shot at this. We need to move fast." "Stay calm," McGraw replied, "and trust the plan. We'll make it work." The first mech reached the top of the ridge, its enormous foot crashing down with an earth-shaking thud. The alien pilot inside had no idea what was coming. McGraw counted in his head, his eyes never leaving the advancing behemoth. "Now, Preach." The sniper's shot rang out, a clean, deadly line that tore through the mech's cockpit with surgical precision. The alien pilot dropped, its massive form stumbling as the control systems malfunctioned. The mech crashed to the ground, sparks flying in all directions. The humans had their opening. "Now," McGraw shouted, his voice cracking through the comms. "Let's finish this." Carter's hands moved with a speed and accuracy honed by years of combat. The recoilless rifle fired, sending a powerful slug into the chest of the next mech. It exploded in a burst of energy, its shielding no match for the sheer force of the projectile. Dawson fired his rifle, his shots landing dead center in the mech's exposed joints, bringing them down one by one. The Marines moved as a unit, their coordination flawless, their spirits high as the tide began to turn. But even as they fought, McGraw knew that this wasn't the end. The Zelkar wouldn't retreat so easily. They were too proud, too determined to crush humanity beneath their heel. No, this battle was only the beginning. As the last of the mechs fell to the ground, McGraw stood tall, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the next threat. He wasn't sure if the Zelkar would back down now. Maybe they'd regroup. Maybe they'd send reinforcements. But McGraw had no intention of letting them win. Not today. Not ever. "We've got them on the ropes, Captain," Carter said, his voice low but full of promise. "For now," McGraw replied, his eyes narrowing. "But we need to be ready for whatever comes next. The battle might have been won, but the war was far from over." The wind howled through the shattered remnants of Outpost Liberty's outer defenses. The battle had raged for hours, the sound of artillery fire and explosions still echoing in the distance. Captain McGraw surveyed the battlefield, his eyes hard, searching for any signs of movement. The Zelkar had retreated, at least for now, but McGraw knew that wouldn't last. They would be back, and when they came, they'd come in force. His team had done their job, no question about it. The ancient M3A1 had shredded the Zelkar's advanced mechs and vehicles with ruthless efficiency. Preach's sniper shots had decimated their command structure, causing chaos and confusion in their ranks. Carter had rigged traps and explosives with terrifying precision, ensuring that no advance went unpunished. And Dawson, he had held his own, learning quickly, adapting faster than McGraw had expected. Together, they had won the first round, but they all knew the fight wasn't over. As the dust settled, McGraw turned to his team, his voice steady, but the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "We don't have long. They'll regroup and come back with everything they've got." "We knew this wasn't going to be a cakewalk, sir," Carter said, wiping sweat from his brow. His face was streaked with dirt, but there was a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. "But we've got their attention. They won't underestimate us again." "That's the plan," McGraw replied, his voice calm but firm. "But we need to be ready for whatever they throw at us next." Dawson stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "What do we do now, Captain? If they keep coming, we won't have enough to stop them." McGraw met Dawson's gaze, seeing the unease in the young officer's eyes. But there was no room for fear. "Not now. We hit them harder. We hit them where it hurts. We make sure they regret thinking they could walk all over us." Preach, who had been silently watching the horizon, spoke up. "You mean we go after their command, right? Take out their high-ups and make them bleed?" McGraw nodded. "Exactly. We've crippled their front lines, but they'll regroup. Their council will send reinforcements. If we hit their leaders, we can break them." The team was silent for a moment, the enormity of what McGraw was suggesting sinking in. The Zelkar weren't just soldiers. They were part of a vast, highly organized empire. Striking at their leadership wasn't just risky, it was a declaration of war. And yet, McGraw had no doubt that it was their only chance. "We'll need intel," Carter said after a long pause. "We need to know where they're hiding their command structure." McGraw gave a sharp nod. "Preach, I want you on Overwatch. Find their command posts, anything that stands out. We don't have time to waste." Preach nodded, his expression serious. "Got it, Captain. I'll find them." The plan was set. The Marines would move under the cover of darkness, using the wreckage of the fallen Zelkar mechs as camouflage. Preach would scout from a distance, his keen eyes scanning the terrain for any sign of a command center. Once they had a location, they would hit fast and hard, using the old artillery to disrupt the Zelkar's leadership. As the hours passed, the team set to work, preparing their gear and double-checking their weapons. McGraw stood off to the side, lost in thought. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for humanity's place in the galaxy. The Zelkar had mocked them, underestimated them. But humanity had always fought back when cornered. McGraw had seen it in the eyes of his men. They weren't going to let anyone push them around. Suddenly, Preach's voice crackled through the comms. "Captain, I've got something. There's a structure, well hidden, but it's there. It's their command. I'm sending the coordinates now." McGraw's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the chance they'd been waiting for. "All right, Marines," McGraw said, his voice low and commanding. "It's time to hit them where it hurts. We move out in 10 minutes. Stay sharp." The team moved out, their footsteps muffled by the soft, dusty earth. The night was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of distant wildlife absent. There was nothing but the stillness of the battlefield, broken only by the occasional blast of distant gunfire. As they approached the coordinates, McGraw's senses were on high alert. This wasn't just a raid, it was a message. They weren't going to be slaves. Not to the Zelkar, not to anyone. They reached the command structure, a heavily fortified compound nestled between jagged cliffs. The walls were made of an alien material, slick and smooth, but they had seen this before. There was always a weakness, always a chink in the armor. "Preach, you've got the first shot," McGraw ordered. Take out the sentries. Preach didn't hesitate. The sniper's rifle rang out, and the sentries crumpled to the ground, their bodies twitching for a brief moment before going still. It was clean, quiet, deadly. The rest of the team moved in quickly, their footsteps silent as they flanked the compound. McGraw led the charge, his M3A1 ready. They planted explosives on the outer walls, setting the timer with military precision. "We've got 5 minutes," McGraw said, his voice cold and focused. "Get to the center and take out their command. This ends now." The team moved deeper into the compound, their weapons at the ready. The Zelkar were beginning to regroup, realizing that something was wrong. Their leader wasn't far. McGraw could feel it in his bones. They would break through. "Over there," Dawson muttered, pointing toward a large chamber at the center of the compound. "That's where the council's hiding." McGraw didn't waste a second. "Move out now." The explosion shook the walls of the compound as they breached the command center. The Zelkar leader stood before them, an imposing figure, his eyes flashing with fury. "You think you can defeat the Zelkar?" he hissed. "You are nothing." McGraw's eyes locked with the aliens, and for a moment there was a stillness, an understanding. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for everything. Humanity wasn't going to lie down and die. "No," McGraw said, his voice a low growl. "We're something much worse." The last shot rang out, and the council member fell to the floor. Humanity had made its statement.